Welcome to the Grey Eye and Disability Arts online podcast, Disability And, bringing together thoughtful discussion and debate. This month, Disability Arts Online Assistant Editor Joe Turnbull chats with writer, filmmaker Jessica Secmezsoy-Urquhart about their PhD research into the royal courts of the Renaissance period and the role that disability played during the era.
Welcome to the Disability And podcast to Jessica. How are you doing today?
I'm good. I've had my first vaccine today.
What was that like?
A big gymnasium and just getting told about, you might feel like this tomorrow and stuff like that. So I'm just happy it's done now.
Feeling relieved?
Yeah.
Jessica, do you want to tell us a bit of background about you and your research interests?
My name's Jessica Secmezsoy-Urquhart. I'm an autistic, disabled writer, historian and filmmaker. I'm doing a history PhD currently at the University of St Andrews on the topic of neurodiverse court fools and bodily diverse court wonders, people like dwarfs and giants at Renaissance courts in Scotland and England, so like the Tudors and the Stuarts. I'm looking at the period about 1500 to the 1600s, and I'm trying to shed light on these people's lives because it's not been studied much and because they've left a big impact on these royal courts and rulers. I'm trying to use stuff like TikTok and videos I do for BBC The Social to kind of teach people my age about disabled history and kind of engage people with history in new ways.
It's kind of funny to use such up-to-date methods to talk about something that happened 600 years ago. But I think that's really important. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about the stuff you do with the BBC?
I'm a filmmaker, but with BBC The Social, I get to do videos that I kind of write, and they cover a lot of topics from stuff like my new video that will be coming out is about Sia's music and kind of my experiences as an autistic filmmaker. Like, what's my views on it as both a disabled person who she's writing about and as a filmmaker. But in the past I've done stuff about things like fire arrows, which is kind of random bit of history, but I try and look at things about disabled people in the modern day but also in the past a lot in my videos for them.
Yeah, I've seen a few. They're really good. In fact, I think I saw the one that you'd done on the anti-vax movement.
It was a really important topic for me. It quite close to me, studying that and doing a piece on it for people. But it's something I feel we have to really demystify, and we have to kind of expose people who are taking these beliefs and using it to hurt disabled people.
Yeah, do you want to tell us a little bit more about the kind of why it was the particular period of the Renaissance and the royal court specifically that kind of interested you for your PhD research?
It's kind of peculiar. It started, I was doing an English lit degree and my disabilities kind of got in the way and I couldn't get into honours level, so I had to take history again, and I grew up with stuff like horrible histories and dead famous books, which are these kind of kids history stuff, and a lot of the stuff it told you about was quite diverse history. They would talk about things like the British Empire, about slavery and things like that in a way that didn't try and hide it from kids, but it just kind of took kids and talked to them as human beings. And so I learned a lot from these books, and at college I'd kind of fallen out of love with history because we were doing stuff like the Liberals' road to World War II and all that. And thankfully, when I got this chance, because I didn't get those grades, I started doing history, and then I got the grades for that and I went on to honours history, and I did courses in Renaissance history with Dr. Sarah Cockram, which made me become really interested in the period, because it's this period of time where everything's changing, where there's a lot of there's the kind of medieval period, things that came before, but also modernity kind of coming together. So it was a kind of combination of things like that that made me look further into disabled history, into the history of the court. And I realised, well, there's these people who are like me, that had these important positions in the royal court. Basically, people, they're called natural court fools, but you could think of them as like neurodiverse people today, court dwarfs, people who were bodily diverse. They got these positions because they were believed to have kind of talents and abilities that other people didn't. One of the most amazing people was Will Summers, and he was given consent by Henry VIII to tell him the truth. So he was like one of the only people who was allowed to speak truths to Henry VIII. He would tell him that he had frauds that were taking money off him and things like that. And it's because in the period, the people like Erasmus wrote about how natural fools had been born that way, that they were allowed to talk truths to the most powerful people in power. And specifically the royal court, for me, what makes it stand out for looking at that kind of history is it's this treasure trove of sources and evidence for what disabled people's lives were like. If you're looking at kind of legal cases or church documents, you will see disabled people crop up, but often you're not getting as much information about them. But for this period of time, the royal courts became a place where disabled people like this had important roles, and they were alongside the most kind of people in the most accounts and records of that time. And it's almost the courts are like a lamp that sheds light on disabled people's lives at that period. It's this hidden history of disabled people at the time that you can find so much evidence of in sources, and how much they impacted court entertainment and rituals and stuff like that. And I feel like it can also change our perspectives on rulers. People like Mary Tudor, who are kind of called Bloody Mary and things like that. She was actually very close to her full Jane and acted as a patron and protector of other people. So it kind of influences how we look at royalty in the past as well.
What kind of roles would they play within the courts? You sort of mentioned the court jester. Was there other types of roles that they might play?
Initially, they're there because, for instance, with natural fools, they were believed to sometimes be more comedic because of that. So there's always a kind of a paradoxical thing with disability in the Renaissance, where there might be elements of ridicule, but there's also this kind of raising up of them. So fools could be seen as funnier. They could sometimes be seen to be able to see into the future, to be clairvoyant. And also they could speak. They spoke honestly. They didn't hide things. They didn't flatter like so many other courtiers, people at the court would do. So for a ruler, this was a really great person to have at your court. And them and people who were court dwarfs and giants were also companions to rulers, people who were different to those in that society. But because of that, because they weren't a threat like someone like a nobleman might be to a ruler, they could be closer to a ruler than those people could be. With court dwarfs and giants, there's this element where they were viewed as wonders, people who were different enough physically that they're wonderful and kind of people to be in awe of, but not different enough that they're seen as monstrous. That's that kind of juxtaposition coming in again, where they're kind of beautiful in their difference, but there's people who aren't like that, and they are seen as kind of not as positively in that period.
It kind of sounds like almost that there was some element of they kind of had the freedom to say things that perhaps others with a lot more positions of power might not be able to in some ways.
They definitely had agency, and there's this kind of, with natural films, at the same time, there's this interesting thing, especially in England, where people who were called artificial fools, i.e. comedians or people who would make money from making people laugh and stuff like that, they were very looked down upon and distrusted because they were believed to be taking jobs from people like natural fools, from people who couldn't do another job. There was this kind of view that you were born with this ability to provide this comedy, to provide these abilities at the core, and artificial fools were people who were impinging on that and trying to take it over. And over time, you get people like Archie Armstrong, who was James the First court fool. He was an artificial fool. So this is after Shakespeare and the rise of theatre starts to change things. You start to have more clowns and people who do comedy for a living, and it becomes less looked down upon. But there's still a limit for people who aren't natural fools. Archie Armstrong, he continued to serve Charles I until he insulted the Archbishop at the time, and he was kicked out of court with his coat over his head. So there was this kind of element of that could happen to people who were artificial fools. One of the only cases I've found in England and Scotland where I look at where that happens to a natural fool is Patch, an earlier fool of Henry VIII. And it was because he had called Anne Boleyn and Elizabeth some very bad stuff, and Henry VIII threatened to kill him, and he had to be protected by, I think it was the master of the horse, like the main man in the stables had to take him in and look after him, because there was that limit for Henry. You don't insult Anne Boleyn.
I'm interested in the idea of the artificial fool as being almost like a Renaissance creeping up.
Robert Armin? I'm trying to remember his name. He was a kind of clown actor for Shakespeare, and he wrote a book about fools called Fool Upon Fool, where it's him recording the lives of different jesters and fools who were natural fools. It is almost like he's kind of showing you, look, you could base your character on this guy or this guy. It's him almost kind of showing his inspiration for his roles, which is weird, but it's also a really great source to read for that.
Yeah, and so they were influential in that way, actually, on the early development of theatre as an art form, I guess. And so I suppose going that far back, it's kind of, you can't underestimate the sort of the butterfly effect that could have had on our forms of entertainment that we see today and stuff.
Will Summers is probably one of the most famous court fools in history, and he's someone he wasn't able to tame Henry VIII, but he was able to kind of be a close ally to him and friend in a court where people were always looking out for something, wanting something from him. There's things of them, stories of them joking together, of him kind of trying to calm Will down when he had difficulties. Will Summers is this really interesting figure because his agency is so obvious that there's been people in the past who've tried to claim he isn't a natural fool. He was very witty and intelligent, but at the same time, he had narcolepsy and needed to have a keeper look after him. And to me, he comes across as someone who's obviously neurodiverse, but over the past few hundred years of history, people have been like, oh, he must have been an artificial fool because of that.
Have you found that being a kind of, a disabled researcher and doing that research from a disabled perspective, have you come up against barriers within the academic world, would you say, like taking that perspective, or are they very open to that approach, as it were?
You mean coming at it with kind of like with a disabled lens?
Yeah. Is that kind of seen as, is that kind of welcomed within the academic space, would you say?
It definitely is with my supervisors. I initially had Rab Houston as my primary supervisor. He's retired now, and he had looked at things like mental illness and disability in the early modern period in Scotland, so like the 1700s. I now have Amy Blakeway, Dr. Amy Blakeway, as my main supervisor, and they've been so accommodating of my disabilities, but also accommodating and like celebrating the kind of perspectives I bring to this, because there has been histories of court fools or court dwarfs in the past, but there hasn't really been much crossover between disabled history and that. It's people who are looking at royal history will talk about it, but people who are doing disabled history will often ignore it.
You're in a Venn diagram in the middle there of those two things, and it's clearly an area that needs more exploration. It's interesting because obviously within the disability studies there's been loads of the really positive stuff, like the social model and things like that have kind of come from that area, but clearly it's also, it's still a place where disabled people are underrepresented, I think, certainly within the kind of the broader research and within history, looking at how disabled people have been represented through history. And I suppose it's just often hard to find that history, as you said. But the royal courts offer this kind of goldmine, as you were saying, for kind of for these stories.
Yeah.
Do you think there's anything in those Renaissance attitudes towards disability that we can see mirrored today?
Yeah, there's quite a big thing, I think, is how our changing views on disabled people have kind of contributed to society and how disabled people impact the world. It's quite disabled rights movement kind of stuff happened a lot later than for other groups, and people like the Union of the Physical Impaired Against Segregation, their pamphlet in 1976 changed so much. And since that, we have been trying to get our voices heard. And for someone like me who's autistic, the idea of neurodiversity is just this fascinating thing to me, because it's about how human diversity is a positive. We should kind of put aside the idea of normal, abnormal. They're things, to me, they're hangovers from the early modern periods. We need to kind of view human diversity as a good thing. Another thing I think we kind of share with the period is just that humans, no matter how bad we can be, we're also deeply kind of defined by our kindness and compassion. As long as humanity's existed, if you look at burial sites of like people in prehistory, there's cases of people who, this person had this injury or whatever, and they lived another 20 years. We've always cared for each other, and in the Renaissance, this was part of caring for people. They had these important roles, but they were also looked after because of that.
I was curious if there's any other kind of historical periods that kind of that interest you, that kind of beyond the Renaissance, if you were to do further research, if you were to do a book in 10 years' time on something else, whether there's other historical periods that are like you'd really love to get your teeth stuck into.
My dream is to one day do something that is like it's like the history of disabled people. And there was an amazing documentary I saw recently which was about disabled people, but it was from, as it often is, from the kind of early modern period, and just things like, I find it fascinating that even when we were hunting animals and just living, I don't know if we were living in caves, it's not my area, but even back then we were looking after each other. People in the Egyptian period, there was a lot of court dwarfs in that period. There's always, something I find fascinating is no matter what period in time and what culture you look at, from an Icelandic jarl to like an emperor in China, most of these ruler figures will have someone in a position that is something like a fool or a court dwarf, especially during the Renaissance. And especially what I found fascinating when I was doing my undergrad was Ottoman court disabled figures, because they had court fools and court dwarfs, but they also had a group of non-verbal deaf servants at the court who would be like pages, but they helped develop a sign language at court, so they could pass on secret messages for the Sultan. And occasionally, I've read occasionally they were used as assassins because they were so silent. I would have loved to have pursued that, but the one thing that held me back was my terrible ability to learn languages, and the fact I would have had to have known Ottoman Turkish, Persian and Arabic to really study it properly. I think one thing with modern histories of disability, there's so much more of it. The good thing about that is there's so many more personal accounts of being disabled by disabled people. The one thing I've found is like a memoir for the Renaissance. It's the Chronica Burlesca, and it's by a disabled court dwarf at Charles V's court in Spain. And he was also Jewish at a time where many Jewish people had been kicked out of Spain. And his book is basically an account of the court and a kind of jokey account of his own life, and how he says stuff like that his coat of arms has a foreskin on it because his dad's got taken off. Like, he does jokes about being Jewish in this book, but also he describes himself as like the gossip monger of the court. So it's fascinating, his account, but it's one of the only ones I've ever found. And because I'm not looking at Spain and I don't know Spanish, I can't unlock it, but I hope someone translates it properly one day, because it's never been translated. But with the early modern period and on into modern history, you have so many more accounts by disabled people. One of the biggest is 18th century politician, MP and author William Hay. He did a book called On Deformity, about his life living with a disability. There's obviously stuff like the Diary of Frida Kahlo and accounts of people who had lived or experienced things like freak shows and institutions. There's so many clearer voices the closer to today you get. And for me, like a lot of my research, it's like those voices are quite far away and I'm trying to get closer. So I do love that about modern disabled histories.
When you mentioned it just there, actually, it occurred to me that was there parallels between the freak shows of the kind of Victorian and early modern era and the kind of the court, there's court fools and that kind of thing.
A book I would recommend on that is Rosemary Garland Thomas's book Freakery, where she discusses and his contributions by other authors in disabled studies, talking about the idea of the freak and kind of showing that a lot of people who were involved in that, they did have agency to an extent. It was a job that you could succeed in if you had certain disabilities. But what she kind of describes is something that my research kind of looks at as well. In the Renaissance, you have these kind of positive views of neurodiversity, bodily diversity. No one's perfect. There's no idea of normal and abnormal in the way we have today. But in the early modern period, medicine, sciences start to change. The royal court starts to change, and disabilities, especially once capitalism kind of comes into, kind of everywhere, that starts to define people by how much worth they have to their society, their economy, and things like that.
In a productivity kind of sense. Yeah.
Thompson kind of describes it as there's this move from wonder to error. People start to be seen as defective, as imperfect. Things like intelligence during the Enlightenment are so important. Suddenly, to be like the best human, the best Brit or whatever, you have to be intelligent, and society starts to celebrate things that are different to what they celebrated in the Renaissance. So there's just this massive change that it still impacts us today, and we're starting to overcome it. But a lot of the problems that we're going through now they started in the 1600s, 1700s, and changing how we view disability.
Yeah, I think that's so important. It's such an important point, because I think there's a general misconception that a lot of these things have deeper roots than they actually do, and some of the notions about things like human nature are totally misguided, and they're nothing to do with human nature. They're to do with the kind of the capitalist ethos of like production and productivity and profit making and viewing people in those units and those terms. And actually, it's really enlightening and really refreshing to kind of get those perspectives from a sort of pre-capitalist era, pre-modern era, that actually tell a completely different story.
It's not a golden age. People with certain things, like especially like conjoined twins, like certain other disabilities, were seen as negatives, and that.
Yeah, sure.
There's always views depending on the time you look at, but I feel like something that's held back so much understanding of disability in the past is, even when we don't mean to, there's still an element of Whiggism. It's this kind of idea in history where humanity is always getting better. We're always becoming more advanced, more modern. Mm-hmm. And that means that we think that people in the Renaissance must have, if you were disabled, you must have been left out to die, things like that. Places like Sparta in the classical period, they did stuff like that, but it's this kind of idea that we're better. We treat disability in our society as better when we're letting people die without benefits in their homes, with no heating on and things like that in the modern day.
I think that sort of self-congratulatory liberalism is so dangerous. Yeah, this idea of progress that you were talking about. Yeah, it leads to complacency, and it's also then stops you from seeing the very real problems that are kind of right in front of us.
I think it's liberating when we consider that it isn't this progression that we have went backwards over the last few centuries, but look, things are never this permanent movement. It's societies are just very different in how they view disability, and hopefully we're learning more than we have in the past.
Yeah, and that leads me on to a point I wanted to raise. And when we're kind of following the social model of disability, it kind of tells us that disability is a social construct, really. So it's kind of something that's always socially constructed. So therefore, it must always be constructed differently in different societies and different time periods, I guess. And so do you think that disability was just almost conceived in a completely different way in other periods?
Sometimes when we apply social theory of disability, the social model of disability to history, it can sometimes guide our kind of thinking of the period. I do feel like disabled people and disability, it's always existed, but how we view it, how people experience being disabled has changed over time and between cultures. One of the biggest and earliest figures in disabled history, Henry Jacques Steicher, he noted that every society has precise social and cultural constructions of things like disability. We have to understand a society to know how they understood disability. And there's so much, it's so complicated trying to do that. But when you look at a time period's view on disability from their perspective, it starts to make sense, especially with the study of neurodiversity in the past. That's very changeable. In the Renaissance, people like Christopher Goody describe it as you weren't viewed as kind of different in kind. You weren't different, like born as this different entity. Like someone with autism is born autistic. you were seen as different in degree. So you're foolish, but it's this kind of spectrum of humanity. And I feel like one thing, like, you kind of see over time, like, different societies have very different views of it, and the biggest change, as I've mentioned, is during the early modern period. What societies in places like England and Scotland saw as something to privilege changed. What things like being an actual fool or a dwarf or giant, what kind of they became was undesired differentness. In Goffman's words, like, and once you're kind of not desired and seen as important in society, that's kind of when stigmatization, when people start to become objects of prejudice. And Vogel isn't that good a historian, he's better at other things, but his work is still influences today in history. In his book Madness and Civilization, he talks about how in the early modern period, the voices which the Renaissance had liberated, suddenly all those disabled people and mentally ill people began to be put into institutions. And it's tragic. It's this like move from the royal court into positions in places where they had no power. And as someone that is kind of like, had experience of that, it's a very personal kind of history for me to study, and I feel like I owe it to the people over those hundreds of years that were impacted by institutions and this change in view on disability.
This feels like quite a good place to stop, but is there anything else that you haven't said that you'd like to say, or anything else you'd particularly like to talk about?
Just the study of how words change when it comes to disability are very intriguing. A recent kind of example of it is how in Britain we view the SP word as a terrible slur. And the reason why that happened was disabled man with cerebral palsy and writer Joey Deacon appeared on Blue Peter in 1981, and instead of inspiring kids, it made him and the SP word become a slur. And I find that really depressing, but it's why in places like America and Australia that word's used more like fool or idiot is. There's this movement of historical terms for disabled people. Over time they become more specific and sometimes become slurs. So terms that were used as the kind of medical and up-to-date term, suddenly over time they become offensive. It's happening especially fast with, as an autistic person, like it used to be terms like Asperger's that were used, but that's kind of been put aside now, partly because he was an awful guy, but also because things like autism spectrum disorder make more sense. So understanding disability a lot of the time also means understanding words. Thing I forgot to mention was I'd pitched for this disabled history article a week ago, and it was a paid opportunity, so I did that, and I got a knockback, and the person's reply was very interesting. They basically said they didn't think they were going to pass because they didn't think that court fools and dwarfs had any impact on history. Even though they're interesting, they had no impact. And I think the person who's probably seen the terms used, maybe that impacted them. Maybe they just think, in terms of those stereotypes of these people, that these figures were just figures of ridicule. But I feel that any disabled history is incomplete if we don't consider pre-modern disabled history like the Renaissance.
Yeah, and that seems provably false to me, given the the prominence of fools in writing, like Shakespeare's writing and things like that. It's it seems like a not particularly informed position for that person to have taken. but there we go. I suppose just as what might also be nice to end on is kind of what would you say to anyone who's maybe thinking about studying history, or maybe isn't interested in history, about why you think studying history is an important thing to do?
If you're thinking of doing history, you should go for it, because there's so many cases where you will be able to see people like yourself, but also people who are very different. You'll be able to see cultures that are incredible and experiences that are very much like ours today. And I feel, especially with disabled history, it shows how disabled people have always impacted history. We've always had a place in society, no matter where you are in the world, disabled people have left their mark. And studying history it's incredible. You get to experience whole other worlds and time periods, and it's both alien and familiar, and it helps change your view on society today and kind of how you can change things.
Thank you, Jessica. That was absolutely amazing. I learned so much. What a really interesting conversation. And so much to unpack and so many names and lots of further reading for us all to do, I think. And so I'd just like to thank Jessica for joining us on the Disability and podcast. Thank you so much, Jessica.
Thank you.
Visit greyeye.org and disabilityarts.online for details of productions, events, interviews, opinions, reviews, and learning opportunities.